Let's cross now to Melbourne. Dr. Judy Courtin is a lawyer and advocate who represents survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. She's been listening to today's apology and she joins me now in our Melbourne studio. Dr. Courtin, the government invited you to attend today's apology. Why did you decide not to go?
Well, there were multiple reasons, really. One of the main ones was that I thought it would be better for my seat, my ticket, if you like, go to someone who was or is a survivor and victim of institutional abuse, unlike myself. And I preferred that. There were several other reasons, and one of the main reasons is that I'm very concerned about today's apology ultimately becoming a hollow apology. Apologies, as we know, can be, if they are effective, can be incredibly powerful, can be incredibly healing. Our nation and all survivors and their families did have to hear today from our parliamentarians that there is finally acknowledgement of the truth being told, or the truth being told by victims and their families. So that's really essential. One of the concerns that I have, and both Mr. Shorten and Mr. Morrison talked about this, is that there's been a commitment now from the Parliament that they will give unequivocal support of all the recommendations from the Royal Commission and put them into action. Now, they are also talking about the importance of delivering healing and justice. An effective apology, if we go back to my research, for example, an effective apology has multiple requisite elements. One of those elements, of course, is proper compensation. And we know that a national redress scheme commenced in July, just a few months ago. And this is the national redress scheme that is supposed to deliver that financial compensation and also funding for counselling. What's really, really concerning is that the Royal Commission's recommendations for this redress scheme have basically been ignored and shunned and thrown out the window. The Royal Commission made these recommendations based on evidence, and they were trauma-informed. Can I just say, and I know I don't have much time, is that the National Redress Scheme as it stands is profoundly unjust. The amount of money, for example, that will go to survivors and victims for counselling, and this is contrary to the Royal Commission's recommendation that counselling be lifetime and unlimited. The maximum number of sessions that a survivor will be funded for counselling would be about 25 sessions, and the minimum amount is about 4. So there is a cap on that. Equally, the assessment framework, if you like, or the matrix that's been used in the current redress scheme is purely based on a hierarchy of abuse. And really there is no recognition, or very little recognition, for the impacts of the abuse on a person. So it's profoundly unjust. Very, very, very few people will be able to apply for the cap of $150,000.
So given what you're saying and your mention of a hollow apology, I mean, what do you make of the apologies today from both the Prime Minister and the Labor leader? Are they hollow?
Much of the apology was not hollow, absolutely. It was vital that the apology addressed the severity of the crimes, the severity of the impacts and lifelong impacts. It addressed the the criminal behaviour, decades of criminal behaviour on the part of institutions. So much of the apology was not hollow. It was it addressed all the important, what was really important for victims and their families. And I was very pleased to see that the apology did also address family members, because they are equally impacted.
The Prime Minister also committed to fund some specific new announcements today, including a museum to remind people this must never happen again, and a national centre of excellence for understanding the impact of abuse. What do you make of those?
I think those are all terrific recommendations, and in fact the interviewees in my research came up with very similar sorts of suggestions. But can I go back? The apologies today also talked a lot about accountability of the offending institutions. Now, accountability comes in different forms. There is criminal accountability, and then there's financial accountability. Let's look at the criminal accountability. It was really interesting in my research that it was much, much more important to victims and survivors that there be criminal accountability of those who concealed the crimes, those who enabled the crimes to go on, was much more important than the criminal accountability of the actual offender.
So the cover-up was something they were really concerned about?
Absolutely. And when we look at proper accountability, in Australia today, we have one conviction, only one conviction, for the crime of concealment. How many people listening today who did have knowledge in the past, are they willing to come forward and, and fess up? There's so little accountability that can also make today's apology somewhat hollow, and for a lot of people quite harmful.
And do you think that do you have concerns that these institutions that have failed to protect so many children from abuse are still not being required to take steps to protect children in the future? Are children still vulnerable?
Look, I do know that institutions have taken very significant steps in terms of prevention. We will have to wait and see how effective those measures will become. Can I just say that when I looked at let's just look at the Catholic Church as an example. The Catholic Church has had now for 20-odd years its own internal redress schemes or complaints processes. And part of my research looked at the effectiveness and the impact, if you like, of those internal redress schemes. And what I've done is I've done a direct comparison, if you like, with those redress schemes and the current National Redress Scheme in its current form. And quite sadly and tragically, a lot of the problems with the Church's schemes continue to exist with today's National Redress Scheme. So, for example, transparency. There was no transparency in the Church schemes. The National Redress Scheme today, there's also no transparency, and very, very interestingly, there is a set of guidelines and policies for the National Redress Scheme for the decision makers to help determine who is going to get paid what. But those guidelines and policies are not to be made public. And if somebody does make them public, there is a penalty there of 2 years imprisonment. So there are some very bizarre, if you like, provisions in the legislation, and that certainly don't address the transparency issue.
So there's clearly a lot of action to follow up from these apologies today. Lawyer and advocate Dr. Judy Courtin in Melbourne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.